They told her the pay was extraordinary. They told her the hours were flexible and the client demanded only discretion. What they didn't tell Renata was that the last interpreter had fled the building in tears, leaving behind her coat, her badge, and one shoe. What they didn't tell her was that her client wasn't a businessman who needed Spanish translation for a real estate closing. He was Enzo Caruso, the man who owned every port from Houston to Corpus Christi, and who had allegedly made a federal prosecutor disappear so completely that even his dental records stopped existing. Renata Cruz stood outside the glass doors of Caruso International Holdings on the 42nd floor of a downtown Chicago high-rise, staring at her reflection. 29 years old, certified court interpreter Spanish and Italian with a specialization in legal and medical terminology. Fired from the Cook County Courthouse 6 months ago for refusing to mistranslate a witness's testimony the way the presiding judge quietly suggested she should. She had done the right thing and lost everything for it. Her savings were nearly gone. Her brother Danny was sitting in a hospital bed on the north side with a spinal cord injury from a construction accident, uninsured, racking up bills at a rate that made her physically nauseous every time she checked her phone. She needed this job the same way a drowning person needs air, not as a preference but as a biological necessity. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. It was a number she didn't recognize. Miss Cruz. You were referred by a mutual acquaintance. Take the elevator to 42. Tell no one where you are going. A man named Hector will meet you at the doors. She hadn't applied for this position. She had whispered her desperation to a paralegal she knew from the courthouse, a woman who said she knew people in private sector translation. Apparently private sector was doing a lot of heavy lifting as a phrase. She should have walked away. Every reasonable corner of her brain was screaming at her to turn around, get on the L, and go home to her quiet apartment and her mounting debt. But then she thought of Danny, the way he'd tried to smile at her through the morphine haze and said, "Don't worry about me, Ren. I'll figure it out." He hadn't figured anything out in 32 years. That had always been her job. She pushed through the glass doors. The man named Hector was built like a refrigerator wearing a three-piece suit. He didn't speak. He gestured with one meaty hand toward a hallway that appeared to have no end, and Renata followed him past 3 security checkpoints, 2 locked doors that required a retinal scan, and a sitting area so aggressively minimalist it felt threatening. She was shown into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The water was steel gray. The sky matched. A man in a charcoal suit was already seated at the head of the table. He wasn't what she expected. She had expected someone old and toad-like, sweating through an expensive shirt. Instead, Lorenzo Caruso was somewhere in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with black hair going silver at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been decided by committee. His eyes were the color of dark amber, almost brown, almost gold, and they were fixed on her with an expression of absolute surgical evaluation. He slid a document across the table without standing. "Non-disclosure agreement," he said. His voice was low and carried the kind of stillness that rooms get quiet for. "Everything discussed in my presence stays in my presence. The penalties for breach are not financial. They are considerably more permanent." Renata picked up the document. Her hand didn't shake. She was proud of that. "What is the nature of the work?" she asked. "Negotiations," Lorenzo said. "I have a meeting in 4 days with representatives from the Velez Consortium out of Guadalajara. The previous interpreter was unreliable. Unreliable how?" His expression didn't change. She translated what she wished rather than what was said. Renata looked at the salary figure at the bottom of the contract. It was printed in a typeface so clean it almost looked polite. But the number itself was anything but. $40,000 for 10 days of work. She did the math involuntarily, the way she always did. Danny's outstanding hospital bill. The physical therapy he'd need. The modified apartment, the wheelchair ramp her mother's boyfriend had offered to build, but hadn't, and probably wouldn't. She signed the contract. Lorenzo Caruso watched her sign it the way a chess player watches an opponent move a piece he's been waiting for. "You'll be housed on site during the negotiation period," he said, standing. He was tall. She hadn't registered that sitting down. "Hector will show you to your quarters. The Velez representatives arrive Thursday. You will attend every meeting, every dinner, every phone call conducted in Spanish or Italian. You will translate accurately and completely. You will offer no opinions. You will not speak to anyone in this building unless they speak to you first. What if I disagree with something being negotiated?" Renata asked. Lorenzo paused. He looked at her for a long moment. "Then you translate it anyway," he said. "Your job is to be a conduit, not a conscience. I was fired from my last job for refusing to be a conduit without a conscience," Renata said. She wasn't sure why she said it. Self-preservation instinct, she decided afterward. Get the relevant information out early. Something shifted almost imperceptibly behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly. More like interest, the way a locked door looks at an unusual key. "Good," he said after a pause that lasted slightly too long. "Then I know you won't fabricate. Follow Hector." The room they gave her was larger than her apartment. It had a view of the lake, a king-sized bed dressed in sheets with a thread count she couldn't afford to know, and a wardrobe that someone had filled with clothes in her approximate size. Business attire, all navy or charcoal or black. She changed out of her own clothes, which suddenly felt shabby in a way that stung, and stood at the window looking at the water until the grey light faded to black. She called Danny's cell. He answered on the third ring, which meant he was awake and not in too much pain. "Hey, Ren. Hey. How's the PT thing about the nerve study results?" "Still waiting." She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "Still, I got a job. Good one." "Short term, but good." "Yeah. With who?" "Private client," she said carefully. "Corporate. Translation work." "Ren." His voice dropped. He could always read her. "Is this one of those jobs where I'm not supposed to ask questions?" "It's the kind of job that pays for your physical therapy," she said. "So no, you're not." He was quiet for a moment. "Be careful, always." She hung up. She was not always careful. She was often reckless in the specific way that people are reckless, when they have nothing left to protect except the people they love. The first day of pre-negotiation briefings, she sat in a room with 8 men who looked at her the way men in rooms like that always look at interpreters, as furniture that talks. Lorenzo was at the head of the table again. He had a legal pad in front of him, and a pen he tapped against his knuckle when he was thinking. She noticed that. She noticed too many things. It was a professional hazard. "Tell them," Lorenzo said in English to a man who had just arrived via video call, older, white-haired, speaking in rapid northern Mexico Spanish, that the port access agreement is non-negotiable on the timeline. Renata translated. "Precisely, completely." The man on the call responded in a stream of Spanish that included a colorful threat about what would happen if the timeline wasn't renegotiated. Renata translated that too, word for word, including the colorful part. The room went very quiet. Lorenzo turned to look at her directly. "Repeat that last part." She did. His jaw tightened fractionally, then he nodded. "Thank you, Miss Cruz. That's useful to know." After the call ended, one of the other men in the room, heavy-set, with a gold ring on every finger and the demeanor of someone who had never been told no, leaned over to Renata and said, in Italian, that it might be better for everyone if she softened certain translations in the future, that certain clients didn't need to know everything that was said about them. Renata turned to Lorenzo and translated that too. The heavy-set man's face went the color of old brick. Lorenzo looked at the man for a moment. Then he looked at Renata. "Thank you, Miss Cruz," he said again, in the same measured tone. "That will be all for today." In the hallway, as Hector walked her back toward the residential wing, she heard Lorenzo's voice through the closed conference room door. It was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made the hair on her arms stand up. The heavy-set man with the gold rings did not appear at dinner that evening. She told herself not to think about that. She had been there 3 days when the first thing went wrong. She was coming back from the building's small gym at 5 in the morning, barefoot, carrying her sneakers, when she heard voices from the executive suite at the end of the hall. The door was cracked open. She recognized Hector's voice first. He was speaking low and fast and in Italian, which he apparently spoke well enough, though no one had ever mentioned it. Renata pressed herself against the corridor wall and listened, because that was what translators did involuntarily. They absorbed language the way other people absorbed light. "Thursday night," Hector said, "after the dinner. The Velez people will handle the scene. It needs to look like an internal dispute." A second voice she didn't recognize said, "And the interpreter?" Hector paused. "She knows his schedule. She's been in every room. She can identify everyone. We can't leave that." Renata's blood went cold and still, like a pond in January. "The Delgado side offered twice what he pays," the second voice continued. "They want the ports. They've been patient. They're done being patient." "Thursday night," Hector repeated. "You have a 4-hour window after the interpreter takes his last call of the evening. Make sure she's in the suite when it happens." Renata stopped breathing. She walked backward in her socked feet 6 paces around the corner, and then she ran. She didn't go to her suite. She went to the only place that made any kind of irrational, desperate sense. She went to Lorenzo's door at the end of the east corridor and she knocked. Nothing. She knocked harder. "Mr. Caruso." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Mr. Caruso, I need to speak with you right now. It is a medical emergency." It wasn't a medical emergency, but it was the only thing she could think of that might get a door opened at 5 in the morning without getting her shot. The door opened. Lorenzo Caruso stood there in a dark grey undershirt and track pants, his hair not quite right, a look on his face that was pure territorial irritation. He held a phone in one hand. He looked like a man who hadn't slept so much as periodically suspended consciousness. "What?" he said. "Hector," Renata said. "He's working for the Delgado site, I heard him. He's planning something for Thursday. He said I'm not supposed to be alive when it's done." Lorenzo was still for 3 full seconds. He looked at her. He looked at the hallway behind her. He stepped back. "Get inside," he said. She sat on the edge of the leather couch in his office, which occupied a full quarter of the executive suite, while Lorenzo stood at the window with his back to her and spoke in Italian on a different phone from the one he'd been holding. His Italian was Sicilian inflected, cleaner than she'd expected, faster than most people could follow. She followed it fine. He was speaking to someone named Pell, giving orders in the kind of shorthand that only worked when both parties had spent years building up shared context, security positions, internal camera access, a name she didn't recognize followed by the word compromised. He turned around. "Say it again," he said. "Everything you heard, exact words, exact order." She did. She was a translator. Precision was her baseline condition. He listened without interrupting, and she noticed that about him, the quality of his attention. Most people listened while they were simultaneously forming their next response. Lorenzo listened like the only thing happening in the world was what she was saying. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long were you in the hallway?" he asked. "Long enough. Did they see you?" "No." He nodded, once, processing. He walked to a panel in the wall beside the bookcase and pressed his thumb to a small pad. The panel opened to reveal a row of monitors, live feeds from cameras throughout the building. He studied them for a moment. "Hector has been with me for 7 years, he said, and his voice carried nothing, no anger, no grief. Just the flat notation of a fact being updated. He was the one who found you, actually. Through the paralegal connection. Renata felt a chill move up the back of her neck. "He selected you specifically," Lorenzo said, still looking at the monitors. "Someone with debts, someone who could be pressured, someone they could use to get close to my schedule." He turned and looked at her then. "Did anyone approach you?" "Before tonight." "No," Renata said. And then, because she needed him to believe her, "I have a brother in the hospital, spinal injury. I'm his only family. I need this money. I wouldn't risk it for anyone who offered me more." He looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. She had learned early that looking away made you look guilty, and she had never in her life been guilty of the things she was accused of. "I believe you," he said. It came out sounding like something he rarely said. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Lorenzo said, "you stay in this suite. You do not leave this room without me. Thursday's dinner proceeds as planned. If Hector sees you behaving differently, he'll move the timeline up and we'll have less control over the variables. I'm a variable now. You've been a variable since you walked through my door." He said it without apology, but not without weight. He was looking at her differently than he had before, not evaluating her anymore. Something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for. "Are you frightened?" "Yes," she said immediately. "I'm also still here, which I think is the more relevant data point." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. The geographic suggestion of one. "There is a bedroom through that door," he said, pointing to the left. "It has a lock. Use it, I'll have food sent up. Don't answer the door for anyone but Pell. You'll know him because he'll say the word meridian before anything else. And what are you going to do?" "Find out how deep this goes," Lorenzo said, sitting down at the desk and opening a laptop, "and make sure that when Thursday comes, the people who think they've planned something very clever understand how badly they've miscalculated." She did not sleep much, but she slept a little. When she woke, a tray had been slid through the door. Coffee, a pastry, a hard-boiled egg. She ate standing at the window watching Lake Michigan silver itself in the early morning light, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that she was hiding in a crime lord's suite because his head of security wanted her dead. She was not entirely successful. At noon, she heard Lorenzo's voice in the office, low and measured, and then a knock at her bedroom door. "Meridian," said a voice on the other side. She opened it. Pell was young, mid-30s, angular face, wearing a plain black fleece. He looked like someone who had made a deliberate lifestyle choice to seem as unremarkable as possible. He set a laptop on the desk inside the door. "Mr. Caruso needs you on a call," Pell said. Velez sighed. They moved the pre-dinner briefing. She followed him into the office. Lorenzo was behind his desk. He looked at her. Something had changed in his face from the night before. The tiredness was still there, but the cold distance was thinner, like a window that had fogged and was slowly clearing. "Ready?" he said. "That's the job," she said, and sat down across from him. The call lasted 2 hours. She translated everything. Every gracious phrase, every subtle threat, everything said and everything left unsaid. She translated the tonal shifts. She translated the silences by noting them aloud. When the Velez representative made a comment in Spanish that was technically about the weather, but was functionally a threat about timing, Renata translated it as what it actually was and watched Lorenzo's eyes sharpen with understanding. After the call, he poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of her. "You translated the subtext," he said. "Not just the words. Words are the least interesting part of what people say," Renata said. "The rest of the language is in the pauses, the word choice. Which topic they introduce after which other topic." He considered that. "Where did you learn that?" "My mother talked around everything her whole life," Renata said. "I learned to translate her by the time I was 6. That got a real reaction out of him. Brief but real. Something in his eyes that was adjacent to recognition. "You were fired," he said, leaning back in his chair, "for translating accurately. The judge wanted me to soften a witness's account, make it less coherent. The defense needed him to seem unreliable." She picked up the water glass. "I translated what the man said, word for word." The judge was furious. "I was let go 3 days later for what they called procedural irregularities." "And you've been unemployed since." "I've been surviving since," she corrected. He was quiet for a moment. "Your brother," he said. It wasn't a question. He had clearly done his own research in the night. She didn't resent it. People like him didn't operate any other way. "His name is Danny," she said. "He's 32. He was on a construction site in August. A platform gave way. He's been in partial paralysis for 4 months. He was uninsured. His employer has been stalling on the liability claim for." She stopped herself. "You don't need the whole story," I asked, Lorenzo said simply. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that quality of attention again, the kind that made you feel like the room had narrowed to just the 2 of you. "He's funny," she said after a moment. "Danny, even from the hospital bed. He sent me a voice memo last week of him doing a bit about the physical therapist who keeps calling him champ. It made me laugh until I cried." She paused. "He's the best person I know. I'd do anything." Lorenzo turned his pen over in his fingers, slowly once. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why Hector chose you." She felt them land. The reminder that her love for her brother was the exact vulnerability that had put her in this room. She set the water glass down. "Then you understand," she said, "that I can't afford to die on Thursday." "No," Lorenzo agreed. "You can't," he held her gaze. "Neither can I." Thursday came in slowly, the way bad days often do. Light and ordinary on the surface, with everything wrong humming underneath. Renata, dressed in the black blazer and dress that Hector had, she now understood with a new layer of revulsion, selected for this occasion. She wore it anyway. She wore it like armor. She sat through the dinner between Lorenzo and the lead Velez representative, a polished man named Octavio who spoke beautiful Castilian Spanish and had eyes like a shark at feeding depth. She translated every syllable. She noted when Octavio's people exchanged glances, and she described those glances to Lorenzo through a small earpiece so discreet it was essentially invisible. Hector stood near the door in his usual position. She looked at him once at the beginning of dinner. His eyes slid over her with practiced neutrality. He had no idea she knew. Pell was somewhere she couldn't see. She trusted that meant he was somewhere effective. Dessert was being cleared when it happened. A junior member of the Velez delegation stood suddenly and knocked over a glass of water. In the scramble that followed, the apologizing, the staff moving, the momentary reshuffling of attention, Renata saw Hector step away from the door and move toward Lorenzo with a specific quality of intention that she recognized not from crime but from hospitals. She had seen orderlies move that way toward patients who didn't know something was about to be done to them. She shoved her chair back and stood. "Mr. Caruso," she said sharply, loudly enough to break the room's attention. "The representative from Velez has just said something that requires your immediate response. Now, please." It was not true. Octavio had said nothing, but every head in the room turned toward Renata and then to Lorenzo, and in the 3 seconds of general reorientation, Pell materialized from somewhere behind Renata and stepped directly into Hector's path. What happened next was not clean or cinematic. It was fast and very loud, and Renata pressed herself against the wall with her heart slamming against her ribcage as 3 members of Pell's teams came through the service entrance, and the room became a tangle of shouting and bodies. She saw Hector go down. She saw Lorenzo on his feet. He'd been wearing a vest under his dinner jacket, she realized, with a sick feeling of retrospective relief. She saw Octavio and his delegates frozen in place, assessing whether this was something they had caused or something they were witnessing. And then it stopped. It stopped the way storms stop, not gradually but suddenly, the energy just collapsing into an aftermath of strange stillness. Pell stood over Hector, who was on the floor, alive, zip-tied. Pell looked at Renata. He said, "You good?" No, she said honestly. But I'm standing. Lorenzo crossed the room toward her. He moved like someone who has been through rooms like this before and has learned to take stock methodically rather than emotionally. He looked at her face, then her hands, then her face again. You flagged it, he said. I saw him move, she said. Her voice was shaking now. The adrenaline was finding the exit. I know the way people move when they're about to do something irreversible. Lorenzo was close. Close enough that she could see the fine tension around his eyes. From the courthouse, from the hospital, she said. I've seen a lot of people get bad news. He was quiet for a moment. His hand came up and very briefly he pressed the back of his knuckles against her cheekbone. Not a caress, not a gesture of romance, more like someone confirming something real was there. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. You saved my life, he said. I translated a subtext, she said. Same thing, he said, and he almost smiled. She thought if he ever fully smiled, it would be genuinely dangerous. The cleanup took hours. Pell's people were methodical. Octavio's delegation, after a frank and surprisingly cordial private conversation with Lorenzo, turned out to be considerably less aligned with Hector's Delgado employers than Hector had believed. A miscommunication of interests that Lorenzo addressed with the particular combination of civility and implied menace that she was coming to understand was simply how he spoke. When it was past 2 in the morning and the suite was quiet again, Renata sat on the leather couch with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and allowed herself to feel the full weight of the last 48 hours. Lorenzo came in and sat in the chair across from her. He had taken off the dinner jacket. There were shadows under his eyes. Hector will be handled, he said. She didn't ask what that meant. She had made a private decision to keep a certain number of doors closed. The Delgado side will receive a message, he continued. Not through violence, through the ports. They will find the access they assumed they were buying has redirected permanently. They will understand. He looked at his hands. Your brother's situation? She stiffened. I know some people in the liability law space, Lorenzo said, and he said it with the careful, neutral tone of a man offering something that might be rejected. Not to coerce. To expedite. The employer's insurance company's been stalling the claim. That can stop. He looked at her. If you want. Renata looked at him for a long moment. Why? Because you heard something you didn't have to tell me. You could have stayed in your room and let Thursday happen, and walked away with $40,000 and a story you'd never tell. He held her gaze. You didn't. I didn't want to die, she said. You didn't want me to die, he said, and it wasn't arrogant, it was just accurate. She had, somewhere in 3 days, stopped thinking of him as a dangerous abstraction and started thinking of him as a person. That was probably foolish. She suspected he was thinking the same thing about her. The job ends tomorrow, she said. It does, he agreed. She looked at the window. The lake at night was black and inscrutable. Danny's physical therapist keeps calling him champ, she said quietly, mostly to herself. That does seem like insufficient recognition, Lorenzo said. She laughed. Actually laughed, a short surprise thing that she didn't plan. She looked at him and found him looking back at her with that almost smile again, the one that never fully arrived. What happens if I leave this building? She asked. The Delgado side knows who I am. They do, Lorenzo said. He was very still. They don't know you flagged, Hector. They won't connect you to the Thursday outcome. But, he paused, there is a them now. In a way there wasn't before you walked through my door. She understood what he was saying. She had arrived with one problem, her brother's bills, the loan sharks of ordinary financial catastrophe. She was leaving with a second problem, the specific kind that came from witnessing the interior of someone else's war. So I'm not safe, she said. Not the way you were before, he said, but you are under my protection if you choose to accept it. Which is? He turned the pen over in his fingers, a gesture she'd catalogued now as something he did when he was working to say something precisely. Not nothing, she repeated. I have a guest house, he said, in River North. It has good light. I understand you prefer to work independently, so it's not. Another pause. He was genuinely being careful, she realized. This was not a man who was accustomed to needing to be careful with words, and the effort of it was visible in the slight compression of his jaw. It's a place. That's safe. Until the situation resolves. And Danny? The liability claim will be cleared within 2 weeks, Lorenzo said. I'll make one call tomorrow morning. The rest is the law working the way the law is supposed to work. I'm simply removing the obstruction. Renata set down the cold tea. She looked at the floor, then the window, then him. I don't want to owe you, she said. I owe you, he said. By the laws of basic accounting, we start even and see what happens next. She thought about her apartment with its water-stained ceiling and the stack of hospital bills on her kitchen table, and the way Danny had tried to smile through the morphine. She thought about the courthouse judge and the procedural irregularities, and the 6 months of surviving on pride and near nothing. She thought about being in this room, which she had entered as furniture that talked, and the way Lorenzo Caruso had looked at her from the very first day as something considerably more complicated than that. "The guest house," she said. "Does it have good coffee?" "Exceptional?" he said. "Then I'll think about it." He nodded. She stood, and he stood when she stood. Old-fashioned, she noted, and somehow that fit him exactly. "Mr. Caruso," she said, at the door. "Lorenzo," he said. She paused. It was the first time he'd offered the name without a context demanding it. She filed it the way she filed everything, carefully, in the right place. "Lorenzo," she said. "Thank you for opening the door at 5 in the morning." "You said medical emergency," he said. "I knew that would work," she admitted. The almost smile arrived, and she had been right. It was genuinely dangerous. But for the first time in a very long time, Renata Cruz felt like she might be exactly equipped for the danger in front of her. She had walked into a building as a woman with nothing left to lose. She was walking out as a woman who had learned that having nothing left to lose was, in the right circumstances, a form of freedom she had never understood how to spend. She intended to spend it now.